Good evening, everyone. I'm Jean-Pierre Cabestan, a research professor at Hong Kong Baptist University, and I'm delighted to have been invited by the Asia Society to introduce tonight our speaker, Mark O'Neill, who is going to talk about his latest book, China's Great Liberal of the 20th Century, Shih, founder of modern Chinese language. Mark O'Neill doesn't need any introduction. He's so well known in Hong Kong and in the greater China area. But I will say a few words about him since I've known him for quite a while now. And he's been in Hong Kong for many years. He was born in London, but he moved to Hong Kong in 1978. And since being in Hong Kong, he has published a dozen of books, many of them both in English and in Chinese. So his most recent books, there are so many of them, but I would just mention the most recent ones, are first the China's Russian Princess, a biography of the Russian wife of President Chiang Ching-kuo, who was Chiang Kai-shek's son. Another one about Israel and China, from the Tang Dynasty to Silicon Wadi, a history of the Jewish people in China. He currently lives in Hong Kong and writes as an author, a teacher, and works also as a columnist. Mark will be starting off this evening with a brief introduction, brief presentation of his latest book about Shih on the PowerPoint before we begin our discussion. And for everyone watching at home, or feel free to drop any question into the comment section, and we can answer those toward the end of the program, so after 6:30. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Mark O'Neill and leave the floor to him for his presentation on his latest book about Shih. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Welcome everybody at home for joining our discussion this evening. I want to thank Alice Mong for her kind invitation and for Cassandra here for arranging everything. We also want to thank Jean-Pierre, our teacher, for moderating the session. I would also like to mention James Leung and his colleagues, and they are going to sell the book, Chinese and English versions, through the bookshop of Asia Society. I'm very grateful for that. Now, today we are speaking about Dr. Shih, the most important Chinese intellectual of the 20th century. He is really an inspiring figure in his life. He was a professor, he was a public intellectual, he was a diplomat, and an individual with a remarkable love life. He wrote 44 books, so it's hard to cram them all into 1 hour. But anyway, let's try. So let's start with the PowerPoint. Okay. So, if you ask most Chinese about him, they will say he was a leader of the new cultural movement after 1919. He was a pioneer of Baihuawen, vernacular Chinese, and then he was ambassador to the US from 1938 to 1942. So here's a photo of him as a young man, and this expression you see, this smiling expression, this inquisitive, curious, optimistic expression is one which he kept his whole life. So we'll end this presentation with another photograph taken just before his death, and you will notice the expression is just the same. Now, he was born in 1891 in December. His father was a high official of the Qing dynasty and the third wife of the official. His father's last assignment was in Taiwan, in Taidong, just the year when China ceded Taiwan to Japan. So his father managed to escape and went to Xiamen, but unfortunately died in Xiamen. Shih was only 4 years old. So then Shih and his mother, they returned to the family home, which is in Shih, which is in Anhui. And that's where he had his early schooling. Now, this is a photograph of the family home in Shih and Anhui. And it was a crowded house because his father's first wife and second wife were there, and then the children of the two wives. And was quite a wealthy family, but it was not a very happy family. There was a lot of quarreling, especially about money. And of course, Hu Shi's mother was the third wife, so she was the lowest in the social order. Now, he was a very excellent student as a child, and his mother decided that for his future, he should study in Shanghai. Now, you know, at that time, Shanghai was the most advanced and the richest city in China, and it had schools which were not available anywhere else in China, and they offered modern education. So Hu Shi's mother believed that for his future, he should go there for study. And of course, this meant separating from him. So it was a heartbreaking decision for her, but she decided this was the best for him. And just before he left, she arranged for him to be engaged to a lady from a neighboring village called Miss Jiang Dongxiu. He was 12 and she was 13, and this lady would become his wife. Now, she was a typical product of a wealthy Chinese family at that time, which is that she had bound feet and she was not educated. So she didn't read Chinese characters. So as we will see later in their life, the two of them really lived in quite separate worlds. So there's a photograph of her shortly after they married. So here's a photo of Shanghai when he went there in the early 1900s, and he attended 3 different schools in Shanghai. And all these schools were very modern. He could study English, mathematics, poetry, ethics. The atmosphere was completely different to that in the traditional Chinese school. And we're just at the end of the Qing dynasty, you know. Everybody knew that the dynasty was going to end. Reform and revolution were in the air. And Mr. Hu threw himself into this atmosphere. He was a keen author in student magazines, and he wrote many articles, for example, against foot binding and promoting the education of women. And in 1910, he passed the exam to get a Boxer Indemnity Scholarship. Now, this was money which the USA received from China as part of the Boxer Indemnity, and the US decided to give back a portion of it to pay for Chinese students to come to America. So Dr. Hu took an exam, passed the exam, and was one of the 70 students who left in 1910. And this was the first university he went to in America, and this is Cornell University in Ithaca in upstate New York. And he was very lucky to go there because Cornell had a very international student body. It had students from Japan, from Korea, from India, from the Philippines, as well as China. And it had women. It was one of the very few universities in America that admitted women. So he was able to meet in Cornell a very wide range of people, both American people, foreigners, and also women. So he stayed there for 5 years, and he started out studying agriculture, but he was, of course, a city boy. He was from an intellectual family. I mean, he didn't understand agriculture. So after 1 year, he gave up and he switched to philosophy, which was much more suitable for him. And in 1911, the dynasty fell and China became a republic. And everyone in Cornell wanted to know everything about China. So he became a very popular teacher. So this greatly improved his English and it improved his speaking skills. So even as a student, he became very gifted at public discourses and handling audiences and answering their questions. And he was very much at ease, even with Americans. Now, this lady is Edith Clifford Williams, and this lady was the love of Hu Shi's life. She was a student at Cornell also, and her father was a professor there. And their love affair lasted for more than 40 years and yielded over 300 letters. And of course, their affair was conducted in English, not Chinese. She didn't speak Chinese. She was a very articulate, highly educated and independent lady, very unusual in America at that time. She had a very unusual father who very much encouraged her to be independent, who told her she didn't need to marry, she didn't need to have children, she should make her own career. And, you know, for in American society at that time, this was extremely unusual. So I think this enabled her to make friends with Shih and become very close to him, because she had this very liberal outlook. So in 1915, Dr. Hu decides to move to Columbia in New York. And here's a photograph of their main campus. And the main reason was he wanted to study under a professor called John Dewey, who was one of the most famous American public intellectuals of his era. And Dewey believed in experimentalism, which means scientific analysis of every problem. So no isms. Every problem needs to be looked at, examined, and you could find a solution to it. And this way of thinking, this scientific way of thinking, was one which Shih adopted for his whole life, which is why he didn't join the Chinese Communist Party or the Nationalist Party or any other party which had an ism. He very much stuck to this way of thinking. And Dewey and Hu were so close to each other that in 1919, when Hu was teaching in Beijing University, he came to China, and he was going to come for only 2 or 3 months, but he ended up staying for more than 2 years. And Hu and his fellow students, they went with Dewey around China, and he gave dozens of lectures. And of course, Hu and his colleagues, they had to translate for him. And this is a poem which Hu wrote. He was sitting in the apartment of the family of Edith Williams in New York. And this was a poem about 2 butterflies. And the 2 butterflies, of course, are him and Edith. And I put this in because this poem is written in vernacular language, Bai Hua Wen. It's not written in classical Chinese. And this became the most important cause of Dr. Hu in his early years. He said that classical Chinese, Wenyan Wen, was a dead language, worse than Latin, and China should abandon it and should make vernacular Chinese the written language. And this was a very controversial statement to make, but he was passionate about this, and he wrote many articles advocating this. And his argument was that as long as China used Wenyan Wen, the vast majority of the population would be illiterate, and China could not become a modern nation. You had to use a language which the public could understand. And of course, he'd seen this in America, the use of English. He'd seen this in Japan, where they'd modernized their language. And there was intense opposition from many intellectuals in China, especially those who dedicated their life to learning classical Chinese. But this was something that Hu started to argue for while he was still a student in America, and continued when he came back to China. And this was the main magazine which was published in China, which published articles by Hu advocating vernacular language. And his articles were read by thousands of people in China. They had an enormous impact. So he was there for 7 years, and he had a very positive experience in the United States. He was very much welcomed by American scholars and their families. They invited him to their homes. They invited him into their life. And he admired American society for many points of view. And of course, his situation was completely the opposite of Chinese workers, you know, in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York, who lived in ghettos, who suffered from discrimination. And there were legal bans from allowing them to bring their wives to America. So his experience in America was completely the opposite of the Chinese at the bottom of the social order. So he comes back in 1917, and he's invited to be a teacher at Beijing University. And he's only 26, and he has a salary of 280 yuan a month, and he has a large Beijing home with 17 rooms. And while he was at Beijing University, there was another person there too, Mao Zedong, and he earned 8 yuan a month, and he was an assistant in the library. So he was able to become a teacher because the chancellor of Beijing University was Cai Yuanpei. And Cai Yuanpei was also someone who had studied abroad. He mostly studied in Germany, and he had a very liberal and reformist outlook. And he needed people like Hu, who shared his ideals and would teach in the same way as he did. So whilst Hu was at Beijing University, he taught thousands of students. He taught very much in the Western manner. He invited his students to talk to him, to discuss with him. He invited foreign scholars to come to China, including John Dewey, Bertrand Russell, Rabindranath Tagore, the Indian Nobel Prize winner. He very much promoted vernacular Chinese, which within a few years became the national standard in the schools and in the media. Now, here's a photograph of Madame Hu, and they had 3 children, 2 sons and 1 girl. And sadly, the girl died when she was 5. She died of TB. Now, when the first son was born, Hu Shi wrote this poem. And in the context of China at that time, this is quite a revolutionary poem, because if you're a Chinese man, your first job is to marry and produce a male heir. That's the first thing you have to do. You have to give a grandson to your parents. And Hu did not accept this idea. So when his first son was born, this is what he wrote about him. And the point he was trying to make was that having a child should be your choice, not your obligation. He was also a keen advocate of free marriage, not arranged marriage, which was the social norm at the time. And as I mentioned, he and his wife, they really had very little in common. I mean, he was a very active intellectual, constantly reading, constantly giving lectures, and his wife had no part in this world at all. She was not interested. So in 1923, he had an affair with a very educated woman similar to Edith Williams, and she became pregnant, and Hu asked his wife for a divorce. And the story is that she took out a vegetable knife and she said, "If you divorce me, I will kill our 2 children." There were 2 at the time, and then I will kill myself. So Hu became scared, and he never asked her for a divorce again, even though he wanted one. He never mentioned it again for the rest of his life. So as part of this intense intellectual energy, Hu started to write books, and this is one of his first, most famous ones. This is an outline of Chinese philosophy, and this was so popular that it went into 7 editions. He also wrote a history of vernacular literature, and 2 of his colleagues at Beijing University became founders of the Communist Party. So Hu could easily have joined the Communist Party, but he had seen what was going on in the Soviet Union, and he decided very early on that communism was not the solution for China. So 27 to 30, he lives in Shanghai because the situation in Beijing is too chaotic. And there he enjoys the freedom of living in the foreign concession in Shanghai. So here's the Japanese Imperial Army having conquered Manchuria. And from Manchuria, they start to invade the north of China. And at this time, Hu makes the acquaintance of Chiang Kai-shek, who is the president. And at these meetings, Chiang Kai-shek outlines to him the military reality of fighting with Japan. So you can see from the figures, there's absolutely no way that China can defeat the Japanese army. So Chiang Kai-shek's advice is that China must win time, build up its own military, and try to get help from a foreign power. So that would be Britain, France, or America to help it fight Japan. So Hu and Jiang had a close relationship. They knew each other for many years. Both admired the other, but the relationship was very conflictual. Chiang Kai-shek considered Hu to be an idealist, talked too much, had ideas which were completely unreal to the reality of Chinese life. Too much time spent in America, talking with liberal intellectuals and not grounded in the reality of China. So in 1935, in June, Hu made this correct forecast that China would have to fight on its own for 3 to 4 years. And this was a very sad situation, but he understood the reality in the United States and in Europe. And this is what he told Chiang Kai-shek. So this is the Japanese army invading Beijing. And Hu and his family were just able to escape. They took 70 crates of manuscripts, and they took refuge in the foreign concession of Shanghai, which was not under Japanese occupation at that time. And Chiang Kai-shek asks him to go to the United States and try to persuade the United States to join the war on Chinese side. It's very much similar to the Ukrainian president today. He is speaking to the US Congress, and he's asking the US to join the battle with Russia on the Ukrainian side. But I chose this to illustrate, this is the sentiment in America at this time, which is we don't wish to be involved in any wars in Europe or in Asia. We came to America to escape these wars. So that was the sentiment, the very powerful sentiment in America at that time. So Hu spent 4 years in America as the ambassador. And the first 3 years were very frustrating for him. He was extremely active. He knew many members of the US government from Franklin Roosevelt down. He knew many members of the US media. He knew many people in the academic world. He was very popular with them. He was invited to give talks all the time. He went on national radio. And of course, he always pleaded the case for China, and it was fighting a moral war against the Japanese invader. But he couldn't persuade the American leadership to join the war because it was not in the American interest. And then in December 1941, the US and Japan have all sorts of frictions. You know, the US stops providing oil to Japan. Japan considers this to be a declaration of war, and they send the fleet from Japan to attack Pearl Harbor. But before the attack, the ambassador in Washington tries to negotiate an agreement with the Americans. And they draw up an agreement, and the British sign it, the Australians sign it, the Dutch sign it. And all it needs is Roosevelt's signature. And if he signs it, the Japanese fleet will return to Japan and will not attack Pearl Harbor. So at this critical moment, Hu goes to see Roosevelt, and he has the ability and the personality to be given an audience with Roosevelt at this critical moment. And for the first time in his life, Hu loses his temper and tells Roosevelt that he cannot sign this agreement because it doesn't provide for the withdrawal of troops from China or for Japan giving back Manchuria. And Roosevelt is persuaded and doesn't sign it. And so the attack on Pearl Harbor goes ahead, and America joins the war with China against Japan. And the man who organized the attack, Admiral Yamamoto, he wrote in his diary on the 9th of December, 1941, this is the day after the successful attack on Pearl Harbor, he said, Japan has lost the war, because he knew that if Japan had a war with America, Japan would lose. So what Hu did was of critical importance. So this is the famous speech by Roosevelt to Congress announcing America's entry into the war. And because of the fact that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, apparently unprovoked, this stirred the anger of the American people, and they supported the war effort. So in 1942, Shih resigns as ambassador, and he's very happy to leave politics. It's not a world he's very comfortable with. And then he moves to New York, and he spends the next 4 years researching, teaching, writing. He has a very wide circle of friends, Chinese ones, American ones. And of course, during this time, he's able to see more of his girlfriend, Edith Clifford Williams. Now, after the war, the Chinese government invites Shih to come back to China and be the chancellor of Beijing University. And this is a great honor. It's China's most prestigious university, and it's one he's been very closely connected with. So he comes back in 1947. But it's a poison chalice for him. He has many big plans to develop Beijing University into a world-class university like Columbia or Cornell. But of course, it's completely impossible. China is in the middle of a civil war. There is no money to build all the projects that Shih has. George Marshall leaves in January 1947. He said, I cannot mediate. There's no hope. So Shih is trying to build up this university in the middle of this terrible situation. And President Chiang is keen for Shih to join the government. He offers him the post of prime minister. He offers him to be candidate for the presidential election 1948, but Shih refuses. He doesn't consider it at all. And I put in this photograph to show you the stress and the pain which Shih is under. This photograph you see is very uncharacteristic of him. His normal expression is very optimistic and smiling, but this photograph tells you the great pain he's under as the head of the university, and many students are involved in revolutionary activities. They are not going to class, they are doing demonstrations. There is no money to pay the student, the salaries of the professors. It's a very depressing situation for him. So in November 48, President Chiang sends a plane to Beijing to rescue Dr. Shih and other intellectuals. It's the last plane they can take before the Communist Army captures Beijing. So Dr. Shih says, in the Soviet Union, you have bread and no freedom. In America, you have bread and freedom. And in the future, China and the communists, there'll be no bread and no freedom. So he gets on the plane with his wife, but his son, Sidu, refuses to get on the plane, and he remains in Beijing. In April the next year, Dr. Shih takes a ship to the United States, and he never returns to mainland China again. Now he settles in New York. The nationalist government moves to Taiwan in 1949, and Dr. Shih would prefer to go to Taiwan because he has many dreams and his many projects that he wants to build. He can't build them in mainland China, so he'd like to build them in Taiwan. But his wife has visited Taiwan, doesn't like it. She says she prefers to stay in New York. So he stays in New York. So he's mostly doing research, writing. The new PRC government issues fierce attacks against Shih for 3 years, 8 volumes of criticism. And in 1957, in September, his son cannot bear the pressure of being the son of Shih. No one will be a friend of his. No woman will go out with him. So finally, he takes his own life. This is a remarkable month. In the summer of 1953, Shih takes his wife, his Chinese wife, And they stay for a month with Miss Williams, his American lady friend, in her house in Ithaca. So it must have been a most interesting encounter. The benefit for Hu is that his wife doesn't speak English and Miss Williams doesn't speak Chinese. So he was able to edit all the conversations between them. Now, this is a magazine published in Taiwan in the 1950s, of which he was initially the publisher. And he remained very active in Taiwan. He would spend 2 or 3 months there, lecturing, writing. And he was very much at loggerheads with President Jiang over the imposition of martial law and the one-party system, and constantly told President Jiang that he should diversify, he should allow a free press and multi-party system. And President Jiang became very angry and said he'd done that in the mainland, and these conditions had allowed the Communist Party to grow and overthrow him. So he was not going to make the mistake again in Taiwan. So finally, the Academia Sinica invites Dr. Hu to become its president. So this is what decided him to move back to Taiwan in 1958. And this is a job he's very proud of having. It's an institution he's been very closely involved with since the 1930s. And just to give you an idea of the range of his thinking, he sets up the National Council on Science Development. He realizes that if Taiwan is to develop as a strong economy, it must develop competencies in science and technology. So this is the seed which has created the high-tech miracle that we see in Taiwan today. It's one of the most important high-tech manufacturers in the entire world. So Dr. Hu was the original chairman of this council, and he persuaded the government to give good funding for this right at the beginning. And this is one of his achievements. Now, this is the final photograph of Dr. Hu and Miss Williams, and it's taken in October 1960 in New York Airport, and she's going to retire in Barbados. So this is a very wonderful photograph. And what she does in Barbados is she edits all the letters that Dr. Hu has sent to her. I think she edits out some of the more intimate parts of it, things that she feels would be hurtful to Mrs. Hu. And then she sends all the letters after his death, to the Memorial Hall in Taipei. So he dies in April 1962 in a meeting at Academia Sinica. And the aftermath of his death is also extraordinary. 40,000 people visit this Elysium funeral home where his body is lying. Tens of thousands of people line the streets to see the body being taken for its burial. Tributes pour in from all over the world. And the Prime Minister, Cheng Cheng, wrote a poem. And we use this poem as the title for our Chinese edition. I think it's very poetic. And very few intellectuals in any country would arouse this kind of emotion that Dr. Hu did after his passing. So here's the final photograph. And as I say, I want you to remember this photograph of him smiling, optimistic, open-minded, just like the photo I showed you at the beginning when he was a young man. That hasn't changed. Okay, thank you for your attention. Now let's have a discussion.
Thank you very much, Marco O'Neill, for this very, very comprehensive and overview of Hu Shi's life. I think we have a bit of time for discussion, around half an hour or so. So I would like to open the floor to questions or comments from the audience. So if you have a question, please put it in your in the chat box of the which is on Zoom if you're on Zoom. Now before I receive any question, maybe can I ask the first question? You mentioned some of the work of Hu Shi, including in his history of Chinese philosophy. Now, later there was another author who wrote a history which became also very influential, Fang Youlan. And can you tell us more about the relationship between Hu Shi and Fang Youlan? Because Fang Youlan Hu Shi was not, well, he was a philosopher partly by training, but he was interested in many different things, and later he will become a diplomat. So he was very, very versatile. And but Fang Youlan, so what was his relationship with Fang Youlan?
Well, this is a very good question, because Hu's friend said he was interested in too many things. You know, if you want to be a scholar and you want to master something, you must concentrate. You see, so Dr. Hu writes volume 1 of History of Chinese Philosophy, but he didn't write volume 2 or volume 3. Whereas Dr. Feng, he wrote volume 1 and then volume 2 and then volume 3. Okay. So Dr. Hu's friends used to call him Dr. half doctorate. You know, he just finished first half, but he didn't finish the rest. And you're right, that's the reason. He had so many interests, he had so many activities, and he was too sociable. You know, he had many friends. He had Chinese friends, he had Japanese friends, he had American friends. So he loved to meet them and go out for meals with them and go drinking with them. He liked smoking, so he would smoke with them. So he didn't have this, maybe single-mindedness, perhaps you might say, boring concentration on just one topic. So I mentioned in the book, you remember the first women president of South Korea? The lady, unfortunately, she went to prison. Yes.
So a lot of Park Chung-hee.
Yes. So during her down moments, she read Chinese philosophy, but she didn't read Dr. Hu's book. She read the book of Dr. Fang, because it was better and deeper. So, but I would say this is not a weakness of Dr. Hu. I mean, he was able to do so much because he had such a wide range of interests. He could have spent all his life in a small university in the United States and written 10 books on Chinese philosophy. But then he would not have done all these other things that he did.
Thank you. I'm looking at are there any questions on the chat room? I have another question regarding some of Hu Shi's other works. Well, he fought a number of battles which were very important for China. The one about Baihua, the language, the vernacular language. Another one about freedom of marriage. So that gave way to articles, publications. But what are the other issues on which he wrote his major works?
He wrote 450,000 words of textual criticism. So these would be of Chinese classics, like the Journey to the West, the Water Margin. And this is something he very much liked to do. So in these times when he was, for example, in New York, and he wasn't ambassador, so he devoted a lot of his energy to writing textual comment on these works. He was also very much interested in Buddhist writings. Once he went to Paris and he went to London and he went to visit, the Donghuang cave paintings. So he wrote a long book about the Buddhist writings from that period. He wrote a history of vernacular literature because, especially when he was young, vernacular was considered to be very vulgar, not to have any refinement. Refined Chinese was all classical Chinese. So to redress this, he wrote a very scholarly book about the history of vernacular literature to show that for several centuries, Chinese scholars had written in the vernacular language, and it was a mistake to see only classical Chinese as the proper kind of Chinese. He also wrote a lot about human rights. This was one of the causes he was greatly very enthusiastic about. You may know a woman called Margaret Sanger, Sanger. She's the founder of the family planning movement in America. And at that time in America, it was extremely controversial. I mean, many people regarded her as outcast, a sinner. And Husserl invited her to China and gave lectures and arranged for articles to be published in Chinese magazines and newspapers. And he wrote a play about the freedom of marriage. And this was inspired by the play of Henrik Ibsen. And the name of the play by Ibsen, I'm sorry, it escapes me.
Isn't it The Puppet House?
Yeah, I think so. Anyway, whose play is really just a copy of the Ibsen play. And what happens in it is this lady goes back to her hometown to visit her parents. And they say, you've got to marry this man that we've chosen for you. And she says, I refuse to marry him. And so the play is just a debate about that. And at the end of the play, she walks out of the house. And the boyfriend that she wants to marry, he's waiting outside in a car. I mean, we don't see him in the play. So Husserl wrote this play in China, and it became an extraordinary success. It was performed in Shanghai, in Beijing, in Nanjing, in lots of cities. And of course, it completely appealed to thousands of Chinese women, because the education of women had begun in China then. So there were thousands of Chinese women who did not want to have their husbands chosen for them by their families. So this was a very eminent professor in Beijing presenting the case for you to choose your own husband. So he was very interested in social causes too. So he wanted to have a big effect on society. Yeah.
Thank you. So he was a kind of influencer, as we say today. Now we've received in the chat box a number of questions. So I will ask them one after the other so you can answer them freely. So the first one is about whether you have any favorite quotes of writings by Husserl. You mentioned some of his writings, maybe quotes, or favorite, what would be your favorite quotes of writing by Husserl?
容人比自由更重要. So this afternoon, I went to some websites to try to understand what he means by this. And what I think he means is you must first listen to other people. You know, freedom is everyone can say whatever they want. But more important than that is to listen to the other side. So he always promotes, you know, freedom and democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of the media, you know, multi-party system. But I think on a deeper level, he would say that the ability to listen is more important. Yeah.
So tolerance.
Tolerance, yes. Because of course that is what was lacking, you know, in the Chinese Civil War. And in 1945, Doctor Who wrote a letter to Mao Zedong. He said, we have just won the war against Japan. You should become an opposition party in China. We should have two parties in China. And we as Chinese should resolve our differences peacefully. We've just had 8 years of war. Please let us not have another war. This is what he wrote to Mao. So there is 容忍. That is, listen to the other side. But of course, Mao just threw his letter into the wastepaper bin and didn't pay any attention. No.
Yeah, we know what happened.
Yes.
All right. Next question is about, do you have any criticism of Khrushchev's philosophies or logic?
Well, I'll tell you what President Chiang Kai-shek said. Doctor Who comes from America, and he comes to Academica Sinica, and there's an inauguration ceremony where he's made the director. So, of course, President Chiang comes because it's the top research institute in America, and in China, sorry, and therefore the president comes to attend. So President Chiang speaks first, and he says the objective of Academica Sinica is 复兴中国文化，复兴中国文化. And everyone in the audience, of course, applauds, because when the president speaks, you applaud. And then Doctor Who gets up and says, it's not. That's not the purpose.
You mean the revival of the Chinese culture?
Yes. He gets up, he says, no, that's not the purpose of Academica Sinica. So the criticism of President Chiang is that who lives in this intellectual world of meetings and papers, and especially in America, lots of discussions about freedom and democracy and human progress and so forth. But it is nothing to do with the reality of China. You know, it's too removed from the reality of China. So if you want to govern China and run China, the ideas of Doctor Who are useful in some part, but not completely. So in the 50s and the 60s, there were great arguments between President Chiang and Doctor Who, because Doctor Who says you must have a multi-party system in Taiwan. You must have freedom of the media. What's the difference between you and mainland China? You know, you must distinguish yourself. And this makes Chiang very angry. So that's the main criticism of Doctor Who, that he was too much of an intellectual and many of his ideas were not applicable to Chinese reality. At
least of the time. There is another question about Khrushchev's relationship with Edith Clifford Williams. How might they live their lives has been different if they lived half a century later? Oh, interesting.
Well, I'm sure if it was half a century later, he would not have married his Chinese wife. And if they lived half a century later, they'd met at Cornell University, Khrushchev could easily have married her, and he could have had a very successful life in America. He could have become a very successful academic. He could have become a publisher. He could have become a writer. Maybe he even could have gone into business, you know, and he would have stayed in America.
But do you think he would have stayed in America because actually he was Chinese? He wanted to go back to China.
Well, yeah, but
yeah.
But if in other words, if he'd married her, you know, 50 years later, and they'd stayed in America, that's what would have happened, and we wouldn't be talking about him at all.
Yeah,
we're only talking about him because he decided, you know, after graduation to go back to China. So his great contribution was to Chinese society. Yeah.
There is another question about Khrushchev, who helped funding China Institute in 1926 in New York City. And the question was, who worked with him on this project? The China Institute in
Yes, I'm very sorry. You're quite correct. And I wrote a letter an email 2 weeks ago to the president of the China Institute. And I said, can I send you a copy of the book? Because he was one of the founders. And I'm sorry, he did found it with another Chinese intellectual, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the name. Forgive me.
All right. Now there's another question about, may I know what kind of inspiration to write this book from you, Marco Nell. So what was the source of inspiration?
Well, in 1980s, I was very lucky to be studying in Republic of China. Sorry, we can't say that anymore, in Taiwan. And my teachers referred to Hu Shi constantly because, you know, his memorial hall, his grave is very close to central Taipei. And my teachers kept saying to me, what you are studying is the legacy of Hu Shi. You are not learning classical Chinese, you are learning Bai Hua Wen. So my teachers very much praised him. And they mentioned some of these things that I have talked about. So it was always in my mind to write something about him. But the opportunity didn't come until about 2 years ago. And I have a wonderful publisher at Joint Publishing. And I asked her if we could do a biography. And I thought she would refuse because so many eminent Chinese scholars have written about him. And some of them have written maybe 2,000 pages. I mean, I bought one of these. It was 3 very thick volumes by a Taiwanese scholar in America. And I was thinking that my publisher would say, well, we don't need you to write this book. But luckily, she said, yes, you should do it. And then she said, should we have Chinese edition? And I became even more nervous. I didn't know what to say. And she said, well, if you write it, we should have a Chinese edition too. So we must make it clear that this is not a book that is at all in the same league as these wonderful books by these Chinese professors. I mean, they've devoted years to the study of Hu Shi. I mean, they're like PhD students. I'm just like primary school student, you know. I know almost nothing. But this is a book just for the general reader, for people who have not studied Hu Shi, who don't have time. And I found that my friends in mainland, I can say, almost know nothing about him. Unless they've been to university and studied Chinese literature, they will know something about him. But the broad mass of people in mainland, they don't know anything. Most of my friends in Hong Kong, they heard the name, but they don't know anything about it. People in Taiwan, a bit more. So me and my publisher felt that there is a market niche for this book. As I say, aimed at the general reader, not aimed at the scholar or the graduate student, but for people who don't have so much time, but they would like to know more about this important person.
Actually, I would recommend very much the book to everyone because it's a very good read and learns a lot about, first of all, the Hu Shi's life, which is quite incredible, and the times he went through and his different jobs and and occupations, but also about how much he has influenced China between the 1910s and the 1950s. It's amazing. I think he had a big impact on many issues. So, but my question, you already sort of alluded to it, is about mainland China. How much Hu Shi is known among intellectuals, the elite in mainland China? Was it a moment in mainland China? I'm thinking of the 1980s, where China was opening and reforming, when Hu Shi started to be studied or read by some liberal intellectuals. It may be less the case today because the liberals have been sidelined in China, but in mainland China at least. But so my question is, how influential is he today, or how much known is he today in China?
Well, we have to go back to Beijing University, in the early 1920s. Mao Zedong was an assistant in the library earning 8 yuan a month. And he had a thick Hunan accent. I don't think anyone in Beijing could understand it. And he didn't wash, he didn't clean his teeth. He was very uncouth. So I think most of the Beijing people, especially in the university, looked down on him. And one day he goes to a lecture by Dr. Hu. But because he doesn't have the student card, he's not allowed in. So I've always tried to understand why Mao hated so much the intellectuals and why we had these campaigns against them. So I think a lot of it has to do with his experience then. So this is, I think, why in the 50s we had this terrible anti-Hu campaign. So at least until the 80s, Mr. Hu was completely taboo topic. But in the recent years, things have changed. I do quote in the final chapters some very good essays by mainland scholars in recent years, and they praise his intellectual work, his academic work of study of Chinese literature, his work in science and technology. And I think his contribution would be seen in this science, technology, promotion of education, modernization, getting rid of, you know, the very feudal and backward customs in China. So I think that would be his legacy. But I think because of what happened in the 50s, because of this denunciation, I think it's very difficult for intellectuals in China to really to do a proper exposition of him. And of course, they can't speak about Chiang Kai-shek. They can't speak of his promotion of democracy, human rights, multi-party system, freedom of the media, and all. I mean, this is so much part of Hu Shi's life, but of course they cannot mention this. So I think in the mainland, I think he is only known to intellectuals and people who study Chinese literature. I think he's certainly not known by the public.
And what about Hong Kong? Is he known here? He must be known.
Well, yeah, you can buy his books in the bookshops. If you study literature or Chinese sociology in universities, yeah, you will read his books. But I think not the general public, no.
Someone who has been a bit forgotten, I would say, maybe by.
Well, this is what my publisher said. When, you know, I was expecting her to refuse the book, so she agreed, and I said, "Well, why did you agree?" And this is what she said. She said, "For most Hong Kong people, they are not aware of this man. So we are fulfilling a market niche, and this is why we must have Chinese edition, not just English one."
Now, in contrast, I guess that in Taiwan is still well known. But what about the young people in Taiwan? Do they still read him or know about him? The young generation of Taiwanese.
Well, from what I understand, you know, he is included in the school curriculum.
Helps.
But of course, now we are in the era of the DPP, you know, and I suppose if you take a very nativist view, you know, Hu Shi comes from the mainland. He's writing mostly about the mainland. He's writing mostly about China. He's not writing about Taiwan itself. So, I mean, of course, that's a very narrow opinion. And because of COVID, I haven't been able to go to Taiwan for more than 2 years. I feel a bit out of touch with things, but I fear that's what may be happening now.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. I'm just checking if there are any other questions in the chat box or from the audience. Andrew, any other question? And or from Nick? Have you seen any other questions? So, do we know how did Hu Shi react to the suicide of his son, Hu Shi?
Well, of course, the mainland did not report it.
Oh,
of course.
We never learned it.
I mean, it's just like the Russian government today is not reporting its deaths in Ukraine. So they didn't hear from him. His parents didn't hear from him. They heard some rumors. But, you know, and I would imagine the people he was working in a Tianjin college at that time. I imagine all the people in the college, the head of the college, his colleagues were just so full of shame, you know, that this son of such an eminent person took his own life. It is so shameful. I mean, unspeakable. They didn't want to. Nobody wanted to speak about it. Anyway, in the course of time, his parents did learn of it. Mm-hmm. And of course, the question is, why did their son not board with them onto the plane? And here we have to say that Husher said it himself. Mm-hmm. I have been successful in my life in many aspects, but I have not succeeded as a father. Mm. That is that he was so busy with all his activities and his speaking and his traveling and so on, he didn't pay proper attention to this son. So this son was very lazy. He was overweight. Mm-hmm. He went to 2 private universities in America, but he never graduated. He liked Beijing opera a lot. So his argument was, I have done nothing against the Communist Party. Why should I leave? Why should they, attack me? Now, his father explained why they should. His father knew very well Soviet Union and how things worked there. But his son didn't believe him. So if they'd had a closer relation, I think his son would have accepted it and come with him. So I think it tells us that the parents and the son did not have a good relation, and he didn't believe them. So in some respect, you could say the parents were responsible for not bringing him out. But of course, the responsibility for his death lies with the anti-rightist movement.
Yeah, I think it's related to the quality of the lack of quality of the relationship between Hu Shizhe and his own wife. I mean, it has, of course, yes, related to that. Yeah. All right. So no, I think it's a great moment to think about and to discuss Hu Shizhe. I'm looking at the chat box, and I've been told by Nick that there are no more questions. Now, I think you can show, the cover of the English edition of the book, and here you've got the cover of the Chinese edition of Mark O'Neill's book. So, on that note, I
just say this book is very easy to buy. We have put 40 copies today in the bookshop of the Asia Society.
Oh, good.
And also you can go to the joint publishing bookshops in Hong Kong, or Commercial Press, or Eslite bookshops. It's all available. So please, the evenings are very long now with COVID. There's nothing to do. So it's a good opportunity to do some reading.
Thanks a lot. Yes, that's a very good advice. I have to say again, I enjoyed very much reading the English edition of this book, and I hope a lot of people will get introduced to Hu Shizhe, a great man, a great life, and I would summarize his contribution to Chinese history and Chinese politics, saying he was a great influencer and modernizer of Chinese society and Chinese intellectual life. On that note, I would like to thank very much Mark O'Neill for his presentation of his latest book, and the Asia Society for having hosted that event. So there will be other occasion to listen to Mark O'Neill, and I don't know what will be your next book about.
I will tell you on Thursday, but
all right,
we will not say in public because someone else may get the idea. So
all right, that's it.
Okay. Okay.
All right. Very good. So thank you. Goodbye to all of you. And
thank you very much, everyone listening, and good evening.
Good evening. Bye-bye.